Hi, Nat Doig here. This is part 2 of The Witches of Bedfordshire, covering the history of witchcraft from 1800 to the present day. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, you can find it wherever you are listening now. And just a heads up, that this episode includes description of animal cruelty. I will warn you before the sections which include this. Hello and welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful and a little off kilter in the town of Biggleswade in Bedfordshire. Each episode, I'll tell you a tale of something strange and unique that has happened in this most English of market towns or its surrounding area. There's an older meaning to the word weird, which means to twist and turn. In Norse myth and in Anglo-Saxon times, this came to mean fate or destiny, all that was and is, and all that is yet to be. Whether it's tales of ghosts or flying saucer hoaxes, the big cat of Biggleswade, or the pot and poisoner, curious social history, or the Great Swan Mystery of 1935, we'll follow all the twists and turns and uncover fascinating stories that will speak to you today, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. The Ravenston Phantom. It's June 1874, at the day's wane. That long lingering golden hour of light that falls in British midsummer. Mrs. Charlotte Goodall and her daughter May are driving home in a low pony carriage. May has the reins. They are on a broad plateau of relatively high ground for Bedfordshire, on the road between Ravenston and Wilden, north of Bedford. The road is unusually wide, with grassy margins before the high hedgerows. Charlotte and May are in no particular hurry. They're enjoying the last of the sunshine, watching hares lolloping in and out of the hedgerow. Only twice has Charlotte offered her daughter instruction on her driving. It's been a pleasant journey so far. Charlotte, who has been enjoying the view, suddenly tenses, her body responding before her brain catches up with what she has seen. A figure, dressed in black, from head to foot, is advancing towards them. The figure is on one side of the wide grassy margins, to the left-hand side of the road. But the grass is short, worn bald in places by frequent use. What troubles Charlotte Goodall, though, is that this figure does not walk. It glides. And it is gliding towards them. "Oh, May, do look at that strange figure," Charlotte exclaims to her daughter. May remains silent. As they pass the figure on the left side of the carriage, both women turn to look. Just 2 yards away from them, the figure turns its face towards the women, and here I will quote what Charlotte Goodall wrote. "Of all the fiendish faces, it was the most horrible you can imagine. Its garments seemed to train behind it. My daughter looked back after it had passed us. She says it turned its face over its shoulder and looked towards us. But by the time Charlotte turned, just seconds after, the figure had vanished. Not round a corner or into the dense hedgerow. It has vanished into thin air. This incident is terrifying enough that Charlotte Goodall committed it to her diary and wrote about it to her daughter-in-law in India. The Goodalls inquired in the local area as to what or who it was they had seen on the road. All they were told was that particular stretch of road is known to be haunted. We know what we do about the Goodalls' encounter today because it was collected by Mr. Podmore of the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, and featured in their 1894 census of hallucinations. Mrs. Goodall had written to the Society when she learnt that they were collecting such encounters. Mr. Podmore visited the women some 16 years after the incident to gather evidence, so memories had faded somewhat, and the SBR were not so interested in feelings or how such an incident had affected the women. They were after facts. Mr. Podmore learnt that Mrs. Goodall had been 50 at the time of the incident and in good health and spirits. Neither she nor her daughter had ever seen anything like it before nor after. He duly noted that he had seen the diary entry and her daughter had signed her mother's letter to vouch for the account as well. And maybe that would be that. A creepy story of a black-clad phantom with a hideous face, until Betty Puttick decided to research the story in the 1990s. In her book, Ghosts of Bedfordshire, she retells the Goodalls' encounter, but follows up with this tale. In 1973, well-known ghost hunter Andrew Green was collecting ghost stories in local pubs around Ravenston and Wilden. In one pub, a young man claimed he had experienced something supernatural only a week before. The young man had been travelling on the same stretch of road as the Goodalls, though exactly 100 years after them. And this is what he told Andrew Green. She was an old woman, all in black, with a long skirt practically to the ground. She was walking slowly along the path beside the road, and as I passed her, I gave her a glance. Blimey, if looks could kill, I wouldn't be here, mate. If I believed in witches, she was one. But until then, I didn't believe in ghosts either. Anyway, I turned back, and there she was gone. Just vanished. This young man had then hurried to the nearest pub to get a stiff drink. He'd told the landlord what he'd encountered, and the landlord didn't laugh at him, but said that a witch was known to haunt that stretch of road, though she had not been seen for many years. Now, Betty Puttick makes a claim that I have not seen anywhere else, but that claim is that this ghost is none other than Mother Sutton, the senior Sutton woman accused and executed for witchcraft in 1612 in Milton Ernest. Now, the Ravenston and Wilden Road does not link to Milton Ernest, and the stretch of road is about 6 or so miles as the crow flies, southeast of Milton Ernest. So it's not impossible to think that in life Mother Sutton walked that spot of road, though why she'd haunt that stretch is a mystery. By linking the witch-like phantom to Mother Sutton, Betty Puttick gets to tell the story of the Suttons' witch trial and then leads on to other witch stories from around the county. Was it a convenient link to make? Or is there a deeper reason or evidence for linking this ghost sighting to Mother Sutton? I fear we may never know, but in the next episode, remember this ghost story when I tell you the tale of Mother and Mary Sutton. Welcome to part 2 of The Witches of Bedfordshire. I'm Nat Doig, and in this episode of Weird in the Wade, we're going to explore Victorian cases of witchcraft and how beliefs have developed during the 20th and 21st centuries. I think it's interesting that there are quite a few ghosts who are claimed to be witches. It's as if we reached the more enlightened, industrial and scientific 19th century still haunted by the witch trials. Witches begin to haunt our lanes and woods, whether it's old Mag, the headless witch, or Mrs. Goodall's sighting of the more traditional black-clad old hag. Witches won't leave us quietly. Our guilty conscience for the way these old women and some men were treated seems to be conjuring witches back from the dead. Our beliefs in magic and witchcraft did not stop in 1800, though many a Victorian intellectual would despair still in country places and amongst young women in particular of the practicing of charms and spells to attract love or fortune. For many, it was harmless fun. For the religious, it was denounced as dangerous meddling with forces out of our control. There is a distinct sexism and classism in the way that the Victorian media and intellectuals portray young parlourmaids and farmhands practising these superstitious rites. But not all of the charms and spells were harmless or frivolous. In 1848 in Bedfordshire, a case of witchcraft practices shocked and sickened the nation. In the cases of Oakley and Silsoe, we are told that many in the neighbourhoods still believed that the old women of Oakley and the Saunders of Silsoe were witches. Yet in this case, in 1848, attitudes have changed considerably, and yet the young women involved are treated very differently indeed to how they would be today. Let me tell you more. There's a curious article in 1853 in the Bedfordshire Independent and Times about a young man named William Crouch, who was accused of stealing some wheat back in 1849. William was a tall lad with dark hair and striking grey eyes. He was arrested and released on bail after this accusation of wheat thievery. This young man had a sweetheart named Mary Bryce. She is described as petite at 5 foot with dark hair and eyes, and she is considered to be good looking. Now, Mary is pregnant with William's child. Certain that he would not be found guilty of stealing the wheat, Crouch had the banns read out in church for his forthcoming marriage to Mary. He was determined to do the right thing by her, but it would be 4 years before the marriage could take place, as days after the banns were read out in church in 1849, young William Crouch was arrested once more, this time for stealing and killing a sheep back in 1847. He was found guilty of this crime and transported to Australia for 7 years. Desperate to return to his sweetheart back in Bedfordshire, Crouch worked his socks off, was obedient and honest as he laboured down under. He was such a model prisoner that he was released early and in 1853 returned to Bedfordshire, a reformed character, where he was reunited with his sweetheart and their baby daughter, although by that point she would have been 4, Patience. The article is celebrating their wedding against the odds. It's a sweet article which doesn't even pass judgment on young Mary Bryce being pregnant before marriage. It says, and I quote, "There is many a slip between cup and then lip." I suspect the fact that they were intended to marry made the slip less scandalous. But what is surprising is that the article makes no mention of Mary Bryce's own criminal past, for she is the ringleader of the group of girls who committed the witchcraft, an animal cruelty crime, in 1848, a year before she fell pregnant. And her excuse for committing such a barbarous act of magic was that she wanted to make William Crouch, her sweetheart, stay faithful to her. It's 1848. Mary Bryce and William Crouch are sweethearts. They are both from poor but working families and live in the village of Harold, next to the smaller village of Odell. William is a farm labourer and Mary a lace maker. In fact, Mary's 8-year-old sister is already making lace for a living. No doubt Mary started at that age as well. Harold and Odell, neighbouring villages, are a close-knit community. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Everyone knows that William Crouch is a Jack the Lad, the kind of lad who can get you a sheep if you're in need of a cheap feast. He turns heads with his dashing looks. The girls of Harold and Odell swoon after him, but Mary is his sweetheart, though she is the kind of girl in constant fear that he will desert her. She confesses as much to her friends. Mary has 3 close friends, and the 4 of them are as thick as thieves, always together, whispering, laughing, turning heads as they walk together arm in arm, ribbons in their hair, shawls wrapped tight, their boots as dainty as they can afford. These young women hold a kind of power. The young men throng to them. The old men watch them closely. The old women curse after them, and the other young women want to be part of their gang. But they are exclusively 4. Mary, who was 19, Sarah, the eldest, at 25, Jane, who was also 19, and Martha, the youngest, at 17. They are north, east, south, and west. Earth, air, fire, and water. They are perfectly balanced, as they are. How Mary Bryce, the leader of the 4, came by the magical charm, we do not know. And she is an unlikely practitioner of magic. She is baptised in the nonconformist Congregational Church in Harold. One of her friends, Jane, who lives a few doors down from Mary on Brook Lane, also attends the same church. They must have shared Sunday school lessons together. The church's Sunday school is more popular than the actual church services and taught many of the local children to read and write a little. Brook Lane itself is a very interesting street. The brook it is named for runs along the side of it, and the houses to the west of the brook are reached by crossing various little bridges. The other 2 women, Sarah and Martha, live in Odell, and one of them has an empty house during the day when her father is out at work. On New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, an auspicious time for working magic, as the veil between this world and the next is thin, just as the old year declines and the new one is born, the 4 girls meet in Odell, in the empty house, to perform the charm or spell. Now, this is where I will talk briefly about what they did in this charm, and please skip forward if you do not want to hear the details of the animal cruelty. Skipping forward just over 2.5 minutes should do the trick. I'm going to share with you the description which the Bedford prison chaplain shared in his update letter to the Lord Lieutenant of Bedfordshire. In his letter, he says that they have admitted the usual character of prisoner into the prison that month, but I quote, with one melancholy exception. I mean the 3 females who had the barbarous cruelty, a cruelty that sickens the very heart, to open up with a pair of scissors the body of a living cat and to take out her heart. The deed was most cruel and abhorrent, and the motive was ignorant and superstitious. It was the belief that by sticking pins in the poor animal's heart, then burying it in the earth, they would bring back their lovers. This happened in a village in Bedfordshire in the year of 1848. The chaplain underlines the words living cat, her heart, sticking pins, burying in the earth, bring back their lovers, village in Bedfordshire, and 1848. His disbelief and shock that such acts could be performed in this day and age are palpable. The rest of the letter is rather staid and straightforward, rattling off the kind of updates you'd expect. How many prisoners have been following their scripture? prison uniforms, etc. No other underlining or exclamation marks are used in the 4-page correspondence. He is appalled by the violence, but most amazed that in 1848 there are young women who believe in magic and will practice such witchcraft. Briefly, the actual act of placing pins in an animal's heart was a well-known charm for all kinds of spells. Often the heart was burnt or placed in a chimney. Some have been found mummified whilst building renovations take place in old cottages. In fact, during the panic of 1963, when the fear of witchcraft performed in graveyards spread in the wake of the desecration of Clophill Old Church, a sheep's heart stuck with pins and nails was found in an Essex graveyard. Mary Bryce hadn't just made up this charm or spell, it is based on much earlier belief. And Victorian books on folklore and beliefs were full of much less barbaric spells and charms that young women could perform to see their future husbands or snare the man of their dreams. It is surprising that Mary Bryce picked such an extreme spell to perform. But how did the women get caught? It seems that the awful act of animal cruelty could not be kept secret, and the youngest girl, 17-year-old Martha Howe, confessed when approached by authorities. The 4 women appear in court on the 29th of February, and 3 of them are convicted of animal cruelty. There is no longer a law against witchcraft, of course. Yet the magistrates make it clear if there was such a law against such superstitious nonsense, they would punish the women accordingly. Martha is let off from punishment for cooperating with the police and courts. She testifies against her friends. Mary Bryce is identified as the ringleader. It was William Crouch whom she wanted to keep faithful to her. It is reported in court. Mary is fined the highest amount, but as none of the girls can pay their fines, they end up in prison. Mary for 2 weeks mending stockings, and the other 2 girls for a week where they mend linen. Mary is described on her prison admittance as being good-looking. It is from these prison entry details that I was able to paint a picture for you of the women. The case is published in just about every newspaper in Britain and Ireland, it seems, most following the same formula, appalled by the animal cruelty, but mainly focusing on the witchcraft elements. Many quote how the magistrate presiding linked this case to that of the Oakley woman's ducking in 1735, Oakley being only a few miles away from Bedford as well. It is the witchcraft element of this trial which has the nation obsessed, not the cruelty inflicted on the cat, although this is reported in gory details as well. But as I mentioned earlier, it is what becomes of these young women that fascinates me. Now, surely they'd become local pariahs for having been so sadistic. Surely they'd be shunned by the religious community for practicing magic. Surely the stain of this crime would stick to them in some way. Yet 5 years later, we know that the very couple, Mary Bryce and William Crouch, tie the knot. And not only that, but they get a sweet newspaper article about the reformed criminal Crouch marrying his patient sweetheart who waited for him. The couple go on to have at least 5 more children after Patience. Mary works as a lace maker all her life, her husband a farm labourer. Though the end of Mary's life in 1890 is a sad one. She is 62, and from the Christmas of 1889 until her death in March 1890, she is a frequent visitor to the workhouse, receiving brandy and meat due to her poverty and illness. Her illness is not recorded as related to old age, as many of the other entries are, which makes me wonder if she had something like TB that could strike at any age. All 4 women marry and remain in Harold or Odell for most of their lives. Jane Matthews rather confusingly marries a William Crouch also. He's a cousin of Mary's husband. They have not become pariahs, exiled from their village, nor do they feel the need to leave, it appears. their notoriety doesn't harm their marriage prospects, and the incident seems not to haunt them in the way that we might expect. 20th century witchcraft. The 19th century did not end Bedfordshire's association with witchcraft, though I have found no major news stories about magical practices like that of the Odell 4 case. As mentioned earlier, at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, ghost stories about witchcraft, both fictional, like M.R. James's The Ash Tree, or the story of Old Mag, become popular. Many of these stories are about old women seeking revenge in death for the injustices that they suffered in life. There is often a hint that these women were in fact magically gifted, but should have been left well alone. The Black Magic Church. In the 1960s, when the desecration of St Mary's Old Church made the headlines, witchcraft and black magic rites were blamed. And if you haven't listened to the episodes about St Mary's Old Church and the ghosts of the Black Magic Church, or my visit to the Black Magic Church, go back and have a listen. I'm sure you'll find them fascinating. This case of supposed black magic rites being performed sparked copycat incidents across the country during the 1960s, where magical symbols were found in graveyards from Essex to Manchester. At the time and afterwards, there was a rumour that an actual witch's coven, based on Wiccan beliefs, was performing rituals, but at another ruined church in Bedfordshire, and that this coven gladly fanned the flames of rumour around Clop Hill so that their rituals could go unnoticed and unhindered by the public, because everyone else was at Clop Hill looking for spooks and witches. A quick search of the local newspapers highlights another aspect of 20th century interest in witches, and that's the fetishization of them. In 1973, the following X-rated films, which would now be an 18, were advertised as being shown at the Bedford Empire. We have Exotic Witchcraft and Lust for Blood. Both were on for a 7-day run. And if you're wondering, Erotic Witchcraft has an IMDb rating of 5.6, and one reviewer calls it strange French crap. 6 years later, witchcraft is on the local newspapers again because of a talk being given to the National Housewives Register group in Biggleswade. Here's what the article says. The headline is Hubble Bubble. Controversial subjects are nothing new to the members of Biggleswade's National Housewives Register. At their next meeting, they will be discussing witchcraft and the occult. Historian Mrs. Rob Lewis of Hitchin, who has studied witchcraft and reads tarot cards, has been invited to talk about witches and the things they do. Witches can do a lot of good, but the press always leap on the black side of their work, she told Feminine Focus this week. Mrs. Lewis, a member of the Hitchin National Housewives Register, has been interested in witchcraft for over 10 years and often talks to local NHR groups about the subject. In contrast to discussing controversial subjects, including a talk by 4 men from the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, the Biggleswade group have been addressed by a speech therapist and a job centre chief. Husbands are invited to the witchcraft evening being held next Thursday, May 19th. Just a reminder that this was 48 years ago. I was 3 years old at the time, and women are still routinely being referred to by their husbands' first names, and gay rights were seen as controversial alongside the beliefs in witchcraft and the occult. I feel very old reading that article and very grateful that things have changed. No wonder feminists reclaimed witches around this time as a powerful symbol of persecution and resistance to misogyny. The devil-worshipping aspect of witchcraft, which had been around most prominently since the 16th century, moved away from witchcraft and into the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. Devil worship was beginning to be seen as something distinct from witchcraft by the general public. Of course, some Christians would be and still are suspicious of any pagan or witchcraft belief and link it to the devil. But in popular culture and opinion, witches have undergone a rehabilitation in the popular imagination. They now represent strong female power in many books, films, TV programmes and video games. Yet many of the stereotypes associated with older women or those who look, dress or behave differently, or are perceived to be a burden or a nuisance, have persisted. So has the language, such as describing an old or difficult woman as a hag, a harridan, or simply an old witch, still persists. The legacy of the Wicked Witch is still with us today, whether we like it or not. And yes, pardons have been sought for the poor women and men accused and executed as witches. Commemorations have been made. Most recently in Scotland, a commemorative witch tartan has been unveiled. Yet I'd argue that we have much further to go to really understand, accept and lay to rest the awful persecution of women deemed to be witches. That impulse to single out those who look, dress or behave differently to the majority, or who are seen as a burden or a nuisance, is still with us today. We may not burn or hang our witches nowadays, but many older and disabled women and men who are deemed different, who don't fit in, are still targeted by hate and antisocial behaviour. Daytime TV and social media still revel in the nightmare neighbour or problem family story. Even politicians point their fingers at groups in society who they claim aren't pulling their weight or who don't fit in and don't want to fit in. So much of modern online discourse is not nuanced, is a simple I'm right and you're wrong. Much of the rhetoric is not that far away from what fueled the witch trials in the 16th and 17th century. The devil and demons might have changed, but the desperate lashing out at someone to blame when you don't understand what's happening in the world around you is still very much alive and with us today. And even 20 odd years ago, but in the 21st century, witches were blamed in Biggleswade for another bizarre animal mutilation. Just a warning, this section does include a brief description of a dead animal. Pigeon victim of witchcraft. Yes, that really was the front page headline in 2002 to a news article which appeared in the Biggleswade Chronicle about a headless pigeon which had been found in a nature reserve in Alsey. Now, Alsey is a village just south of Biggleswade. It has the claim to fame as being the longest village in the country. Now, this newspaper article is a bizarre story. It started when shooting was heard coming from the reserve. A witness described the sound as being a large shotgun being fired. Not an air rifle that kids might have, but a shotgun. Now, shooting of any kind was not permitted in the nature reserve. The next day, volunteers combed the area and discovered the remains of a pigeon. It had been decapitated and its body had been stuffed with leaves. The newspaper even included a large photograph of the pigeon's body. One of the volunteers rather ominously says that it could be part of a witchcraft ritual and that, I quote, "other strange things have been going on in there in the past." Not surprisingly, an indignant letter appears the week later in the newspaper from a woman who appropriately lived in Merlin Drive, explaining very succinctly and effectively that pagans and modern witches would never harm a living creature. It is quite odd to me that even in 2002, the newspapers and volunteers spring to the conclusion that this grisly find is connected with witchcraft. There seems to have been no other sign of ritual taking place, and I've never heard of a witch using a gun, and a shotgun at that. I may listen to far too many true crime podcasts, but the killing and dismembering of a poor pigeon would have me worried about a disturbed young man in the area who could go on to commit violence towards people as well. Not witches. Old meets new. It seems that we can't escape the pull of magic, witches and witchcraft, even now in the 21st century, whether that's being afraid of it, like the volunteers at the nature reserve were, or embracing it. And social media is full of witchcraft videos. Just search Witch Talk or Witch Sky. And it's not just 21st century young women and men who are interested in witchcraft. The interest in folklore, which began in earnest in the late 19th century, meant that country practices of divination or herbal spells and remedies began to be collected. Yes, some of the collections of the folklore saw it as nothing but superstition and it should be preserved for history's sake. But many who collected those stories did hold out hopes of proof for an ancient pagan religion, as discussed in part 1 of this episode. The collection of this folklore and customs has been invaluable in preserving some of these beliefs, especially some rites of passage for young women. As a teenager, I remember browsing through dusty old tomes in Newquay Library in their occult section around 1987, which included collections of country superstitions and spells. Many of the simpler versions of these spells or rituals were repeated in Jackie magazine or Just 17. A common ritual was to attempt to peel an apple without breaking the peel and then toss the peel over your left shoulder. The peel would form the first letter of your future husband's name when it landed. I tried this and I got the letter I, or J, we decided. I'm married to a Jason. I also, at age 12 or 13, one Halloween, sat up until midnight and, brushing my hair by candlelight, stared into my dressing table mirror in the hope of seeing my future husband's face. I was so scared I took off my glasses so I could see very little at all. But reflected in the mirror was a magazine on my bed with Rick Astley on the cover. When I realised this, I was quite annoyed, as I wasn't really a fan of Rick Astley. Why couldn't it have been Morton Harkett, I thought. You see what I mean, though, about sexism being built into these spells? They're from a time when women were expected to marry and only marry men and to remain married. Who they married would make or break their chances of a stable and rewarding life. There were no other options open to them. So it's not surprising then that there's so many rituals for a young woman to see who her future husband might be. I hope that today such rites are still being performed, but also show future wives and partners, or maybe even divine your future outside of just love matches. The Pancake Day Witch. There is one delightful Bedfordshire witch custom that takes place on Shrove Tuesday or Pancake Day in the village of Toddington, Bedfordshire. There is a grassy mound known as Conger Hill in Toddington. Conger probably comes from an Old English word, coninga, which means a rabbit warren. But before it was a warren, it was a motte from a Motte and Bailey castle. The castle is thought to have dated to the 12th century, but is long gone. Its mound remains. We know that as far back as 1865, the schoolmaster for Toddington School allowed the children a half-day holiday on Shrove Tuesday. He did this because there was a well-established custom for witch listening in the village. The custom was as follows. Just before midday, the church bells in Toddington would ring. This was to remind the women of the village to start preparing their pancakes. On hearing the bells, the children were released from school and would run to Conger Hill. There they would lie on the muddy grass, ear to the ground, and listen for the sound of a witch who lived in the hill, cooking her pancakes. Many a young child has sworn that they could hear the pancakes sizzle, even the flip of the pancakes as they were tossed. This custom has waxed and waned over the last 160 years. It was popular again in the 1950s, but had died out around the late 1970s, possibly because the children were getting muddy and overly excited, and with more families having both parents at work and children no longer being allowed to fend for themselves in such circumstances, it became impractical to let them have the half day off. But since 2012, the custom has been revived with the school's cooperation. Teachers now accompany the children to Conger Hill and then back to school afterwards. The church bell still rings, and those who don't believe in the pancake-making witch have speculated that the vibrations of the church bells cause the sizzling sound to emanate from the ground. Personally, I like to think that it's really the Conger Hill witch. If I was a witch, I'd be a pancake-making one, for sure. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I do hope that you've enjoyed it. The next episode of Weird and the Wade will be a deep dive into the case of Mother and Mary Sutton, the mother and daughter accused and tried as witches in Milton Ernest. Don't forget to visit the show blog for more information about the witches of Bedfordshire and witches and witchcraft from further afield. And just a reminder that the persecution of people, including men, women and children suspected of witchcraft, is something that is still very real today in many parts of the world. You can find out more about that on the blog as well, Weird in the Wade. If you would like to support the show, then there are many ways that you can do this, from following and sharing Weird in the Wade on social media or with friends and family, to buying Weird in the Wade a coffee on Ko-fi.com. You can also support the show via Patreon. All the links are in the show description where you're listening now. And if your podcast app of choice allows, then please do rate or review Weird in the Wade. It really does help other people find the podcast. I am really grateful for all of your support and your interest in all things Weird in the Wade. Thank you so much. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Theme music and the track Waking Up are by Tess Savigear. All other music and additional sound effects from Epidemic Sound.